I think I was invited because I wrote a book last year, or earlier this year, on the sacred architecture of Irving Gill. As Roger said, that's available over there. But also, you are, as Roger said, getting the first draft of my next project, which is building on Gill. So I'll start talking about Gill, but then looking at more sacred buildings in San Diego from the 20th century. So that's my subject, but it wasn't a sacred building which inspired the lecture. Instead, it was the view from my window. I'm the rector of St. James in La Jolla, which is opposite the Museum of Contemporary Art, and this is what I see from my window. The picture was taken a few years before the wonderful new extension, and one day when I should have been writing a sermon, but I probably had preacher's block or something, and I was gazing out of the window. It occurred to me that what I was looking at was, in some sense, the story of 20th century architecture. The house in the middle that Irving Gill built for Ellen Browning Scripps was built in 1915. And any time I have a visitor to La Jolla, I always ask them when they thought that house was built. And none of them get within 25 years. It's an amazing building. Then on the left, there's the extension built by Robert Mosher in the 1960s. And in the middle, the work of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, finished in 1996. So in other words, there's Gill's pre- or proto-modernism, the mid-century modernism of Mosher, and the work of Venturi and Scott Brown, the iconic post-modernists. So here's three main movements in 20th century architecture from my window. Then it occurred to me that Gill built about a dozen churches, Mosher built a few, and the mentor of Venturi and Scott Brown, Charles Moore, the leading light of postmodernism, built a magnificent church. And all of these are in San Diego. So that became the inspiration for the talk that I'm offering this morning. So what we see in these buildings that I'll be talking about is not just the main movements of 20th century architecture, but also the shifts, deep shifts that occurred throughout the 20th century in the thinking and philosophy and theology behind sacred architecture and what a sacred building should look like. And my thesis is this. I don't think there's a city anywhere in America that has such a unique, comprehensive and high-quality collection of 20th century sacred architecture as San Diego. Somebody might make a case for Chicago, but even Chicago, I think, doesn't quite match the quality and quantity of sacred buildings in San Diego. In the year that Gill arrived, in 1893, the Tribune declared that San Diego was a city of churches, and this is typical of the kind of churches that were being built. This was the downtown Congregational Church built by William S. Hebbard, soon to become Gill's professional partner. And lots of the churches built in the 1890s look like this. They have corner steeples and are built in a Gothic or Romanesque style. It was a difficult decade for churches, the 1890s, so the church was in decline, and there was a strong drive across the denominations to build in a distinctly ecclesiastical style, to reinforce the message that churches weren't as divided as people thought. If they couldn't agree on theology, they could at least all build churches that looked the same. So Gill and Hebbard developed a very successful partnership. They built a couple of churches together. This is the largest church they designed, the First Methodist Church in 1906, that looks very much like all the other churches that were being built in San Diego at the time in its Gothic revival style. It was an impressive building. The Tribune claimed it as one of California's major buildings. But it was not without its problems, as Gill himself must have known. For instance, it's a very insincere building. Its outward Gothic form does not correspond to the interior or what goes on in the interior. Roman Catholic churches, which of course were built all at this time in a Gothic design and style, were designed for the celebration of the Mass. whereas in a Methodist church, the focus is on the preacher and the sermon. And there is something deeply ironic about a Protestant church whose forebears had broken away from Rome, deciding to build an imitation of a Roman Catholic church. And the flaws are very obvious when you see the floor plan. This is not the floor plan of the Methodist Church. This is the floor plan of the cathedral, National Cathedral in Washington, built in the same year that Gill's and Hebbard's Methodist Church was built. It's very much a neo-Gothic design with a Gothic layout and floor plan. It has a classic longitudinal layout, and it's all about the procession, starting at the west end over here, leading down the central aisle to the altar where the Mass is celebrated. There's that move and procession from the secular to the holy. The altar is raised up and separated by what's called a rood screen. A Gothic space is created to be a world apart. The stained glass not only fills the space with beautiful light, it means that the worshipper can't see out of the building, because the worshipper is meant to be the creating of a heavenly city. And so the worshipper is an observer of what's going on at the front of the altar. Now, this is the floor plan of that Methodist church I showed you. You'll see there's no altar. The focal point is the stage where the preacher preaches. That's where attention is focused. The floor slopes towards the stage. It's not longitudinal, but rectangular. Jean Kilder has written a wonderful book about the churches of the 1890s, which is entitled When Church Became Theatre. And what we see here is a typical example of this phenomenon. It's not something that a Gothic architect would recognise as a sanctuary. This is better described as an auditorium. There's no separation of space. It's one large, undivided room. Sadly, this church was knocked down in the 1960s. The lot is still empty, and it's being used as a car park. In fact, if you see a car park downtown, the chances are that a church used to stand there, and what was a city of churches has now become a city of car parks. Anyway, Gill must have been uncomfortable with what he was designing with Hebbard, as very soon after that church was built, he left the partnership and the next year built the Allen House in Bonita, which showed him to be on a different trajectory. This is a very significant house. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with it. It's claimed to be the first anti-ornament house. And in 1909, Gill was able to put this new approach and method to work on a large scale with a new Christian Science church in Bankers Hill. The congregation had grown out of the church on Ash Street, which Hebbard and Gill had built for them in 1904, which is now the home of King Attorney, whose posters you've seen on every single bus in San Diego. This was a time when Christian Science was growing exponentially, and much of its growth, deliberately so, was amongst the affluent members of society, which is why it's deliberately built on a prominent location in the posh neighbourhood of Bankers Hill. It was there as a statement about their success and their desire to become part of the establishment. You can see from the preliminary sketches that, like the Allen House, Gill was starting the design process with a pure rectangular shape. And it makes for a very interesting comparison with Hebbard's Unitarian church, built the same year. It's very clear from these two images that the two architects are on very different paths. They have a similar form, but Gill's lack of ornamentation is startling and is one of the things that gives that building a modern feel. But it's not just the lack of ornamentation which makes the building feel modern. It's also the colour. It's the same shade of white outside and in. Now, of course, white was to become the colour of the international style, and it's the colour we now associate with spirituality. If you go to a yoga centre or a wellness centre, it will inevitably be painted a crisp white. But that was not always the case. Think about the Gothic churches, highly coloured, stained glass windows, highly decorated. But Gill's church was white and full of light, which was ahead of its time. So I'll share an example of a church near where I used to be in London. It was built in the early 20th century, and you can see, as was typical of the time, it's full of colour. Then a few years ago, a very dynamic priest came who trained at the Slade Art School, and he gave it a modern feel, and the main thing that made it feel modern was the way he painted it. He painted it all white. He also commissioned the famous British sculptor Anthony Gormley to create a statue for this space, but sadly it was deemed by the diocese to be too distracting as it was so well endowed. So it was never installed, and I don't know where it is at the moment. But anyway. This, coming back to Gill, 1911, he built on a smaller scale this church for the African American community. And I think this is a magnificent building, way, way ahead of its time. The narrative of sacred architecture in the 20th century begins in the late 1920s in Germany. And Gill never gets a mention, even though he's building buildings like this, in the early 1910s. And I think he's just so ahead of his time that he doesn't get included in the chronology of the narrative. It was the wrong building at the wrong time. Sadly, it's been almost completely destroyed, and the central bit has now been moved and incorporated into a hotel. There's one more Gill church I'd like to mention, 1929, another Christian Science church built on Coronado. It's there looking better than ever. Over the summer it's had a bit of a refurb, and it looks really good now. Again, it's a Christian Science congregation, the third church of that denomination that Gill built, and that's not a coincidence. Gill's architecture fitted with Christian Scientists' teaching. They were looking to rationalise Christian doctrine, to strip away what they saw as the mythology that had clung to the central core. And Gill's stripped-down, rational architecture matched their stripped-down theology. So this is a building without symbols or ornamentation. It might be plain, but Gill was keen to emphasise its beauty, what we might call the beauty of simplicity. He wrote to the church soon after it was built and said that he hoped that the worshippers would respond to the gentle allure of beauty in the space. Note the characteristic arcades. And I'd like to offer a comparison between this church and the house that is reckoned to be Gill's masterpiece, the Dodge House from 1916, also now sadly demolished. What's distinctive about both is the cubic massive. The fact that Gill felt he could adopt the same style for both domestic and sacred buildings showed that he didn't develop a particular architectural vocabulary for sacred buildings. And he wasn't aiming to build places which spoke of transcendence. Gill could build calm, restful spaces, but he was less successful at building something which inspired a sense of awe. In other words, he was designing what's been called an architecture of immanence. There's no transition space in the church in Coronado. Entry is via a nondescript door at the side. The worshippers can see out of the windows into a beautiful courtyard, which is deliberately meant to be part of the worship space. And this integration of the inside and the outside carries theological weight. The worshippers are not taken out of this world, rather they're grounded in this world, and they are reminded that they are part of the created order, and that the sacred realm and the spiritual realm are one. The church, as shown in the drawing on the left, has 8 different roof levels. And I think we can all agree that Gill came a long way from the first of his churches that we looked at, that 1906 Gothic Revival Methodist Church. As in his domestic architecture, his sacred architecture moved from historical revivalism to something we now recognise as distinctly modern. Gill's work introduces certain themes into our discussion of sacred architecture that will continue throughout this presentation. First, there's the question of style. Gill failed to find a distinct sacred style, which means he didn't answer the question of what's an appropriate style for a sacred space. And the domestic feel of the building meant that Gill's sacred buildings were more of a house of the people rather than a house of God. And by doing away with symbolism and a sense of history, Gill was not creating buildings that created memory. Mario Botta, the influential Swiss architect renowned for his churches, has said that it is not the function which is fundamental, it's not function which is fundamental to architecture, but history and memory. He's adamant that a sacred building has to be full of memory. So let's move on to mid-century modernism. In the post-war period, the population of the region grew dramatically. Many new subdivisions were created and space was set aside for sacred buildings. This led to what the Union Tribune called a renaissance in sacred architecture. The peak year was 1959, when 34 churches were built in San Diego, and the next decade the average was 18 a year. One man was responsible for nearly 70 of these buildings, Robert Deloriez, based for his whole career in La Mesa. And it's not perhaps surprising that he gained the moniker Mr. Church. If Gill was the main focus of attention in the last section, then Deloriez is the central figure in this section on mid-century modernism. In addition to his many churches, Deloriez's final project was a mosque, the Abu Bakr al-Siddiq Mosque, now known as the Islamic Center of San Diego in Claremont. This was the first purpose-built mosque in San Diego. Deloriez was well placed to take advantage of those bustling post-war years. He was a very able architect who, as a man of faith, understood the needs of a congregation. His first sacred commission was Carlton Hills Lutheran Church in Santee, and this remained his most significant project. The mission board of the American Lutheran Church commissioned Deloriez to build a church in the new suburb of Santee before there was even a congregation in the community. They saw the opportunity to have a church in this new place and did not want to let the opportunity slip by. The plan was to build a new church in a new community, which made a statement to the neighbourhood that their message was relevant to a new age. A building in a historically mimetic style would not have worked in this context. What was required was a church building which looked to the future and not to the past. Deloriez won the commission without finalising the plan. His firm was new, and this was his first sacred building. He understood very well what the mission board required of him. His brochure set out the aim of his firm. Quote, "Faith for today is not locked in the past. It is our aim to create the style of church that expresses what is 20th century Christianity." And I think he pulled it off in this building. If this building was in Palm Springs and not in the back end of Santee, I'm sure it would be a place of pilgrimage.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure that Santee's got a front end, but anyway, it's in Santee. He wasn't sure at first what style was appropriate for this desire to look to the future and speak to the new age. He dabbled with traditional forms and materials, but was not satisfied. There was nothing that stood out and set the project apart from what other firms were doing. Then, he said, we found a new avenue to pursue, and this new avenue was over the border in Mexico. Deloriez discovered the innovative work of Felix Candela, and he found the inspiration for which he was searching. Candela was exploring at this time what was possible with thin shell concrete and was creating dramatic shapes such as the hyperbolic paraboloid, which is replicated in this Lutheran church. When Deloriez built this roof in Santee, it was the first hyperbolic paraboloid in San Diego and probably California. It's a striking structure constructed of 2-inch thick concrete in the shape of a saddle with a double curvature. But despite the curvature of the shape, it's made up of straight rods with no internal support. And Deloriez was not able to find a structural engineer that was able to work with him because this was such a new design idea. Eventually, he recruited Richard Bradshaw from LA, who had heard of Candela's work and was also keen to experiment. And they weren't hampered in any way by the building inspectors because it was completely beyond the realm of their experience when they built this. So Dolores said that when they came to see what was going on, they didn't comment, they just stood by and gawped. So the roof is not the only striking element of the design. Dolores took great care with the windows. The structure wouldn't allow for large windows, so he designed 188 small windows of different shapes, which are randomly placed in the walls. I think you might see an echo of Le Corbusier here. They tell the whole story of the Bible from beginning to end. In 1963, he looked to Candler for inspiration once more for his Calvary Chapel, now known as the Canyon Ridge Baptist Church in Linda Vista.
Yeah.
In this design, Dolores again explores the plasticity of thin shell concrete to create a dramatic shell-like shape. This building was considered so dramatic and interesting that the year it was built, it was actually listed by the San Diego Tourist Authority as one of the top 10 sites in San Diego.
Wow.
And this is an example of how Dolores adopted the form of a secular building, copying a restaurant that Candler had built in Mexico City, to create a sacred space. Gill had done away with prescribed sacred forms, and in the post-war period, there was in San Diego no dominant ecclesiastical style. Clyde Smith, when reviewing San Diego churches built in the 1960s, said this: "No clear style emerged. What characterized the movement of sacred architecture was variety." Now, this isn't the case in many other parts of America. In New England, for example, the colonial style dominated. But here in Southern California, there was an overwhelming desire to give expression to modernity in sacred buildings. And this expression could take any number of forms. So, for example, modern masters such as Richard Neutra and Albert Frey built decidedly modern but very different churches in San Diego. The congregation of St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Carlsbad originally commissioned Carlton Winslow to build a church in the Spanish colonial revival style, for which he was well known. However, they had a change of heart and decided they wanted a church which was a, quote, better expression of their faith. So by commissioning Albert Frey, they were committing themselves to a very modern building. The church, completed in 1959, is in good condition. Not only is it not in a cruciform shape, it's asymmetrical, something characteristic of modernism, but not traditional sacred architecture. Here's an image of the interior, and the church recently completed an extremely successful and sensitive addition to the narthex. Now, the unusual horizontal bell tower clearly foreshadowed the roof of Frey's famous tramway gas station in Palm Springs, built in 1965. Richard Neutra completed various buildings in San Diego, including one that I'm pretty sure maybe nobody in here has seen because it's very tucked away in an inaccessible location. Neutra designed the Airman Memorial Chapel in 1957 on the Miramar Air Corps base. The fact that this building functions as an interfaith chapel means that it suffers from being cluttered with the paraphernalia of more than one religious tradition. And the landscape around the chapel has been ruined. That pond is no longer there. However, the beautiful photographs taken by Julius Schulman show what this building looked like in its prime. As well as opening the possibility for churches to be built in any number of styles, Gill had anticipated modernism's antipathy towards ornamentation. And this raised problems in sacred buildings, in which ornamentation is not merely decorative, but also heavily symbolic. The ornamentation of religious symbols in a sacred space conveys meaning and actually binds the congregation together. Dolores addressed this potential problem by incorporating symbolism into the structure of his buildings. In this way, the symbols were not added to the design. They were rather they were incorporated into the design. The best example of this is Claremont Lutheran Church, 1966. And this is a church which is designed to look like the open pages of a Bible. That's a great building. And here's an image of the interior. And just as an aside, let me say that the exhibition I'm curating at the Historical Society in La Jolla in the summer, we're going to have a room dedicated to the stained glass in the modernist churches of San Diego. Because, there's a fantastic collection of stained glass, and we'll see another great example later on. The first Lutheran church in Vista again incorporated symbolism into the design. There's no ornamentation here, not even a cross, yet the interior is dominated by protruding beams, which symbolise the crown of thorns placed on Jesus' head at the crucifixion. The church is not laid out in a traditional longitudinal form. The pews are arranged in a circle with the congregation gathered round the altar. This George Lyons shot shows the drama of the exterior. It's not as dramatic now as it was originally, sadly, as the roof wasn't actually able to support the weight of that tower, so it had to be reduced in height. And I should say that all the black and white images that I'm showing are by George Lyons, who used to work on the Union Tribune, took some fantastic photographs. I don't know anything about him, and I think I haven't been able to find anyone who knows anything about him, which is sad. The colour images that I'll be showing, if they're any good, they're taken by Darren Bradley, and I'm grateful for his generosity in sharing them with me. If they're not so good, then they were taken on my iPhone. The circular layout became increasingly popular at this time. One outstanding example is the first Congregational Church in Lemon Grove, 1968, designed by Parevsky, Mitchell and Dean. This building's definitely under threat. Last time I was there, it was empty. Theological and liturgical developments in the middle of the century were pushing building designs in this circular direction. The so-called liturgical movement had come to exert an enormous influence across many denominations in the middle of the century. The main emphasis of this movement was that the church was a body of people rather than a building. Worship was regarded as an activity for the whole community and not simply a clerical exercise witnessed by the congregation. The minister of this church was expressing the spirit of the liturgical movement when he demanded that the sanctuary must reflect the unity of the church family gathered round the table. In other words, sacred buildings became less about inspiring awe and more about making people feel at home. The move to round churches was common across the denominations. The Northminster Presbyterian Church in Claremont was a circular building designed again by Deloriers. The people-centred nature of such design was reflected in the development of a sacred campus, as seen here in Northminster. In addition to the sanctuary, the church had a school and halls equipped with a commercial kitchen. The post-war suburban church was not designed to be only used on Sundays. This was particularly true of Southern California, where neighbourhoods were springing up so rapidly, with a population made up of migrants with no roots in the area. For these new suburbs, it was especially important that the church building functioned as a community centre throughout the week. The church building was designed to be a focal point for the neighbourhood and a community meeting space. The Roman Catholic Church was very intentional about building churches in the round. The Second Vatican Council, 62 to 65, had an enormous influence over every aspect of church life, including architecture. And one of the key requirements of the council, following the lead of the liturgical movement, was that worship services required the active participation of the people. This meant that the traditional longitudinal shape of the Gothic church went out of favour, as people sitting at the back in such a building were so far removed from what was happening at the altar, they could not really participate in the liturgy. In order to have the congregation feel more like participants than observers, the altar was moved forward and the pews were arranged in a curved fashion around it. As in Gill's church in Coronado, this had the effect of making buildings feel like a house of God's people, rather than a house of God. The Church of St. Catherine Le Bure, 1966, also in Claremont, is an archetype of the Second Vatican Council design. It was designed in a circular form by Alfonso Macy of Deloy and Macy, and it now functions as the parish hall. The circle was divided into two semicircles. One was used for Sunday Mass. It's a flexible space with an outer rim, which can be separated by movable walls to create 8 classrooms. Even the altar could be closed off by a curtain when the space was being used for something other than worship. The flexibility, functionality and simplicity of the space contributed to what the Second Vatican Council wanted, which was buildings which had a spirit of humility. That's very evident in this church. This new spirit was part of the shift the Council wanted to see from a triumphalist church to a servant church. What we see in St. Catherine Labouré is a building which demonstrates the mid-century modern reaction against monumentality, ornamentation, revival styles and extravagance. And in some ways, it might be regarded as an endpoint of the movement started by Gill's Christian Science Church in Coronado. Gill too had rejected the excesses of historicism, and like Gill's masterpiece, St. Catherine's Labouré does not have a distinctly ecclesiastical form, and it is simple and plain. But in this building, functionality has trumped beauty. We'll end this section with a church community which resisted the emphasis on humility. This is the first United Methodist Church under construction in Mission Valley. This is a church which I'm sure everybody has seen, because it's off the 8. It was built in 1963 at the cost of $1.6 million, which made it the most expensive sacred building in San Diego. The Methodist Church in California did not come under the influence of the liturgical movement, as so many other denominations did at this time. They developed their own approach. They recognised that many new churches would be needed as people flocked to the area after the war. And to prepare for this growth, they created in the 1940s a Bureau of Church Planning. And the stated aim of this group was to enrich the worship experience by emphasising the, quote, dignity, beauty, and ecclesiastical symbolism of sacred space. So in other words, they wanted to create more churchly spaces. The first director of the Bureau was Reginald F. Inwood. In the early 1960s, Inwood had the chance to put the ideas of the Bureau into practice on a grand scale. And the First Methodist Church of San Diego decided to leave behind the neo-Gothic church, which Gill built for them, with which we started this lecture. They left that building and moved here. Downtown San Diego had slipped into decay, and it was clear that it was time to move to the suburbs next to one of the freeways. The community chose to build a metropolitan-sized church. Inwood was hired as the architectural consultant, and like many Californian architects, Inwood was inspired by something that he saw in Mexico. But it wasn't the work of the pioneering modernists which caught his attention. Rather, he took inspiration from the cathedral in Mexico City, which is the largest church in Latin America. Inwood adopted a traditional longitudinal shape, but built with modern architectural values. It was the largest building on the west coast to be built using precast tilt-up concrete. The magnificent light-filled sanctuary is made up of a series of parabolic arches. It seats 1,000 people. The altar is raised at the front of the church, and behind it are clear glass panels which lead to a garden. The church, unlike the congregation's previous church, had what's called a split chancel design. This meant that the altar was at the centre of the sanctuary in the most prominent position, with the pulpit and lectern either side, which was required by the Bureau of Church Planning. Inwood designed all the furnishings in the church in great detail. The ends of the pews, for example, you might notice are the same shape as the roof. And this wonderful building doesn't fit easily with many of the buildings considered in this section, but it did address some of the limitations of modernism. It had a modern form and used modern materials to create a sacred space which aspired to be bold, beautiful, and inspiring. It could certainly not be accused, as so many mid-century churches were, of being banal. And let me end this survey of mid-century spaces with some slides of buildings of architects that you might be familiar with, beginning with Sim Bruce Richards. He built this church in 1947 in La Jolla, which I'm pretty sure most people who live in La Jolla haven't seen this church because it's really tucked away in the middle of the village. He later built a Lutheran church in the UTC. Lloyd Rocco built St Andrew's Episcopal Church on the left in PB there. He also designed the Pioneer Congregational Church in 1959, which I simply found impossible to photograph. But you can see something of the flamboyance of the design by looking at the blueprint. There's no corner or rectangle in sight. Another significant San Diego architect, Robert Mosher, who was mentioned earlier, designed a couple of churches. My favourite is All Souls Episcopal Church in Point Loma, which has a magnificent interior. It's worth visiting this church just to look at the light fittings. And the space is dominated by these glorious stained glass windows designed by Jim Hubble. Here's the community church in PB by Richard Larrow, who had a penchant for circular buildings. This building also is empty and at risk. I'll mention a couple of people who made their name in Palm Springs. William Kreisel designed the Israel School of Religion in Bankers Hill. This is the back of the synagogue. And William Cody built this magnificent chapel for the Urian Fellowship in Ramona. The beams were much longer before the termites got hold of them. It's a beautiful space with commanding views. The fireplace, which my wife is about to show us, thank you, was commissioned particularly for this space. And I've got one final word on mid-century modernism. Even Irving Gill got a mid-century makeover. Remember his Christian Science Church in Bankers Hill? Well, this is what it looked like in the 1950s. Thankfully, in the 1990s, it was taken back to its former glory. So, post-modernism. It could be argued that postmodernism was seen at its best when it was employed in the design of sacred buildings. This, I think, is definitely true in San Diego, where we have some outstanding examples of sacred buildings built in the closing decades of the 20th century. The rich language of historical design was once again sanctioned as an appropriate source for architectural inspiration. No longer was it considered important to be ahistorical. Ornamentation was no longer shunned, allowing for richer iconographic language in building design. This gave the opportunity for architects gathered under the broad label of postmodern to address some of the problems and shortcomings evident in the sacred buildings of Gill's and the modernists. These architects were more inclined to adapt a collaborative approach and value the input of their clients. They were more attuned to how people felt when entering a building, and the seriousness of a sacred project served to keep in check the playfulness, some might say facetiousness, which characterises some postmodern buildings. To illustrate the point, I'm sorry this isn't a great photo, but I'm going to start with the Lutheran Church on Ash Street, which is one of the very few churches to remain downtown. And the reason I'm going to begin with this church is the architects were invited to address a problem with this 1960s building. It's not a very good photograph because it's from the 60s. And the original building consisted of a brick rectangular square, which could be seen on the photo. It was deemed by the congregation to be unfit for purpose, largely because it was, in their words, unspiritual. And I don't think anyone would argue with that conclusion. I've hinted already that appearing unspiritual was a problem for modern churches. The fundamental principles of modernism, including rationalism, functionalism, a lack of symbolism and historical reference, are all at odds with what a worshipping community is often looking for in a sacred building. Corbusier famously said that a house was a machine for living in. Well, surely it can't be said that a sacred building is a machine for worshipping in. Sacred building has to speak of a spiritual realm beyond the material. So in order to achieve this, The church hired donors, the local firm, who've done over 250 sacred projects. And their interest in churches goes all the way back to the founder of the firm, Dominic, who was the son of a Baptist pastor. And they came up with an elegant solution. They simply added a spire. There's no attempt here to look like a Gothic church. The spire has a contemporary idiom, but it has the same concern as the Gothic church, to create a holy space. The congregation were very happy with it, as were the architectural critics. It won a prize and was noted for the transcendental presence of the building. In other words, it was felt to be a spiritual building. And it's interesting that verticality is coming into play here, as opposed to so much horizontal work done by the modernists, which is what makes them very difficult to photograph. I want to talk about two more buildings which demonstrate how postmodernism addresses the shortcomings of modernism. The first is by Rob Quigley, and I'm very conscious that I'm speaking in his presence. Good to have you here, Rob. And I should say, as you probably know, that Rob's not particularly comfortable with the label of postmodernist or any kind of ism, but that he does share certain traits, and we see in this building certain traits of that particular ism. And the church in question is St David's in Claremont, and I apologise for not having very good photographs of this building, because it deserves much better photographs, and by the summer I'll have some. It's a small, modest but beautiful church. There's image there of a sketch, and Rob came to the project with a great respect for the context and tradition of the community. And postmodernism at its best is people-centred. It's about developing a collaborative process, not so much about a single architect imposing a vision which could work in any number of contexts. It's finding what works best for the people in this situation. It's not an ideological approach, it's about creating a particular context in which a design emerges. Robert Venturi, whose work at the museum was featured at the beginning of this lecture, talked about a both-and approach to design. He was open to receiving all ideas, putting them together, which suits a church community, which likes to function with everybody having an input. I know from sometimes bitter experience that church communities always have lots of ideas and opinions, and the people at St David's were no different. They wanted, and here I'm quoting from the brief, they wanted a building which is both inviting, welcoming, and open to the neighbourhood, and private and secluded. They wanted a place which is familiar, common, and unpretentious, and special and unique. A church which is straightforward, practical and functional, and spiritually transcendent. A building with exquisite detail and handcrafted care. And you know what's coming next? Cheap! A good postmodernist architect welcomes such a challenge. They're looking for richness of meaning in the building. They're looking for complexity, not simplicity. As Venturi famously said, less is more. Postmodernism has a desire to draw on history and tradition. So St David's includes this stone in the entryway in a prominent position, purportedly coming from St David's Cathedral in Wales. It serves no function. It simply provides a link to tradition. It also might say something about the gullibility of Americans, but we'll leave that aside. Rob was aware that churches evolve over generations and have things left over, which is why these pillars at the entrance to the church, they don't support anything, if you notice. They have no function, they're simply left over. They provide a layering of meaning, and it's this desire for layers which accounts for the design of the chancel. There's a circle within a rectangle. It's both circular and rectangular. The circular wall provides a soft counterpoint to the primary shape of the square plan. And this, according to Rob, helps to avoid the functional but very secular auditorium layout. The concern for embedding memory in a building is illustrated beautifully by the congregation of Beth Israel in UTC, a building that I didn't know was there until I went to visit it, and it's an enormous building. It's a building designed to evoke memories of the past. The architect, Randy Robbins, travelled to Israel for inspiration. He recognised a strong physical relationship between the site and the terrain of Jerusalem, and he created a building which evokes the old city of Jerusalem. It's on a monumental scale, but very cleverly nestled on its site so it doesn't draw attention to itself. There's a stone facade, silvery rooftop, watchtowers, and other ancient features such as arches, domes, and a biblical garden. This is the community's third synagogue. The chapel has a dome and stained glass windows which are designed to evoke the memory of Beth Israel's previous synagogue in Bankers Hill, which had those features. There's a clear sense of transition from the secular space in the courtyard to the sacred space of the sanctuary, and the transition is marked by colours which gradually deepen from the neutral colour of the desert at the entry to the richer blues and scarlets around the bema, from which the Torah is read. These colours were selected from the most sacred parts of the sanctuary, with descriptions of the old Jerusalem temple found in the Hebrew scriptures. The symbolism continues in the structure of the building. The ceiling inside the sanctuary reflects the form of a tent, representing the wanderings of the Jewish people. The stone at the front of the sanctuary was brought from Jerusalem. The bema is relatively low, with curved seating around it in a way that has been observed in earlier designs, which reinforces the concept of the congregation gathering as a community. And so we come to the final building I'd like to discuss, and this, sorry Rob, might be my favourite, the Church of the Nativity in Rancho Santa Fe, built in 1989 by Charles Moore, a key figure in postmodernism and a mentor to Venturian Scott Brown. Moore, like all good postmodernists, was keen on a collaborative approach with his client, who in this case was the parish priest, Father Dennis Clark, who I found out yesterday was the heir of the Stater supermarket. So money was not an object in this project. Moore said to the priest at their first meeting, "An architect is only as good as their client." To which Father Dennis replied, "Well, Mr. Moore, prepare to be very good." And he was. This is a fantastic building. Just a bit of background. You might well be familiar with Moore's work. He designed the Civic Centre in Oceanside. And Irving Gill had started on a big plan for this, but only a small part of it was ever built. And what we see in Moore's work is a sensitivity to the former work of Gill. You can see echoes of Gill's characteristic arches. Moore is sensitive to history, tradition, and memory. And then he adds that colour and a general sense of playfulness. He includes familiar elements, but then he produces something unexpected. And I was up at the church yesterday, and I found a really good example of how Moore's playfulness was reined in by the priest, because he got some huge angels designed for the front of the church, and the priest took a look at them and just said they were too whimsical. So that even now, 30 years later, they're still in the artist's studio in Wellington. So the priest reined him in, and I think brought the best out of him. All these characteristics are evident at the Church of the Nativity. He got a very clear brief from Father Dennis, who knew that his people were well-to-do and affluent and in high-pressure jobs, and he was mindful of meeting their needs, which aren't the same needs as a church in a suburban or a poorer community. And he thought what they really needed was a place away. So unlike Gill's church in Bankers Hill, which was deliberately placed in a prominent position, here the church is set back from the street. There are many transitions in the plan. Coming to church here involves making a journey from the sacred to the secular. And it's not a straight journey. Father Dennis knew that the spiritual journey is not in a straight line. There's always twists and turns. Hence the turns that need to be made just to get into the sanctuary here. So you go back one more, sorry. So you go through the courtyards, and then you see you have to take a left turn into the narthex, and then a right turn into the sanctuary, which is itself symbolic of the twists and turns one makes on a spiritual journey. The courtyard is deliberately reminiscent of the missions. He's sensitive to the Southern California context. The tile roof, there's a citrus grove, the fountains and the stucco walls are all mission elements. And the wall is inspired by the garden wall at Mission San Juan Capistrano. And all these memories are being evoked on the way into the sanctuary. On entering the sanctuary, there's a sense of the familiar and also an encounter with something new. So look at the roof in this image first. That's going down one axis, and you'll see the floor plan is going down another axis. It could be disorientating, but it absolutely isn't. This just works. So if you look at the floor plan again, the design is asymmetrical, and the altar is actually in the corner of a rectangle. It's not clear if this is a longitudinal basilica shape or a rectangular auditorium. It's both and. And there are elements of various design shapes in this layout. Moore is very aware that buildings speak to us, and he's fluent in the rich language of architecture. He draws on a rich and varied vocabulary, including the familiar and the surprising. Let me draw out a few features. Moore is comfortable with symbols and ornamentation. The most striking symbol in the building is the cross. He didn't go to a church outfitters to buy it. Moore bought the figure in Mexico City when he was visiting Louis Barragan, who was a good friend of his, with Barragan on his deathbed. It's reckoned to be 500 years old, and the cross the corpus is mounted on is modern, but it's a copy of a crucifix from Florence. There's a very, very clever use of light and colour. You'll see there's a window behind the cross that allows the altar to be bathed in light during the Sunday morning Mass. And great attention was given to the mullions to ensure that there were no shadows cast behind the altar. The baldacchino, which wasn't there in the previous photograph, but is there now, is new. It's covered with stars, because this is the Church of the Nativity. The lattice ceiling is symbolic. It's there to give a sort of glimpse through to the transcendent realm beyond the material. So it's decorated with silver and gold leaf behind to emphasize that transcendence. It's pointing to a mystery beyond. Here's another medieval statue that this was bought in France by Renzo Sacchetta, who's gone on to have a great practice in LA. He worked as Moore's assistant on this project. It came from France, and you're not allowed to take antiques out of France that aren't damaged. Some rules they have, typically French. And so this statue didn't have any fingers when it came to the church. And then the carpenter who did the lattice work restored it. But it fits really well there, and it's placed against a yellow wall. I mean, there's nothing else. There's no other yellow in the building. It's just the wall behind this is yellow. It could all be chaotic, but all this, the combination of the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, it works beautifully. There are many multiple layers in the building. So what we find at the Church of the Nativity is not only a wonderful sacred building, but also a place where Moore's architectural philosophy was given full expression. It's a place where tradition is made new. Moore has taken memory from the past and transformed it with lessons learned from the modern movement. It's into a stunning building which meets the needs of the contemporary worshipping community. It's a wonderful choreography of the familiar and the surprising. And I think the Church of the Nativity provides a very fitting place to end this look at sacred architecture of San Diego. I do hope that it's deepened your appreciation of the wonderful sacred buildings that we have here. Maybe I've persuaded you that our collection of sacred architecture is more unique, more comprehensive, and of a higher quality than any other city of America. If you know of different places that I should be looking at and adding, and I'm mindful of the narrowness of my focus, and there are other buildings out with traditions I'm less familiar with that I should know about. So do let me know. Do we have time for any questions, or shall I just, because I'm done? We do have time for questions.
Unitarian Universalist Church in Hillcrest.
Yes, George Lycos.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It's-
Wonderful building.
It's one of those kind of,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is a great book. Lloyd, there was a competition for that church for the architect, and Lloyd Rocco lost out by a single vote. Because I'd love to see.
well, that's the Unitarian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did any of the architects, did any of the architects that were in practice during the same period use the same structural engineer?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I've no reason to think that they did. The bits and pieces I do know, I haven't seen any of that. That would be particularly interesting to know about the concrete roofs, because
Right.
so few people were working with that at the time. So actually, that's a question I should pursue.
Oh, I was gonna suggest the Church of the Latter-day Saints in La Jolla. I don't know if they'll let you in, but that one, I remember the first time I saw that, I was driving down on the 5 in a very foggy night, and it was all lit up, and I almost ran off the road. But I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The other comment I had is I really want to thank you for the breadth of your research in looking at various denominations and the way they're interpreting or using architecture to express what their beliefs are.
Yeah.
And I've learned some stuff here that I had no idea Charles Moore did a church in Rancho Santa Fe. Certainly go look at that. But also looking at the commonalities and some of the challenges of doing sacred architecture during the modernist period, where you really cannot use iconography or any sort of overt message or meaning in the architecture. So I just thank you. It's a wonderful lecture. It's given me a kick in the head, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys, and actually you make a very good point there. That I hope when I'm talking about sacred architecture, there are principles that apply to architecture in general, because every building has a meaning, whether we intended or not. All buildings speak, say different things. But the thing about sacred architecture is that it's the intention to convey meaning, to speak, is very deliberate. And the client, the religious community, is wanting the building to say certain things. So I think there's something there which I hope is of broader interest and relevance to architects and people interested in architecture more generally. And just a question of two things about that temple, which is an amazing building. It was built by Hyndman and Hyndman, who built a better church in Scripps Ranch. They went on to do a Roman Catholic church in Scripps Ranch, which is beautiful. And they wouldn't let me in. And even if I did get in, I don't think it's very interesting. There's not a big sanctuary inside. It's all split up into lots of little rooms.
So it's all shown on the outside.
I think it's all, I think
Yeah,
so.
well that's an interesting contrast as well.
Yeah,
Where are you putting the architecture?
yeah. Put it by.
So yeah, I mean, to me it was like this huge billboard. I thought it was encountering Disneyland.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. I appreciate the knowledge that went into this presentation. Thank you. I think the thing that's always stood out to me over time, or at that time, you mentioned in 57, 59 is when the majority of the churches were built. That's also when Hawaii became a state, and San Diego took on the Polynesian. And I think a lot of those roof lines and a lot of the shells and a lot of that is actually something we had connected with Hawaii because of Pearl Harbor Navy connections. And I think that's what you're seeing that others you won't find in Chicago.
In fact, there is the best church for that. Dolores built a Presbyterian church in Spring Valley, high up on a hill, with a tiki roof. And the critics at the time absolutely hated that.
And grew up 3 streets down.
Yeah, well, that's an odd. I mean, that's an odd looking building.
And I do think it's part of our tiki moment.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I would say, I do think it's interesting, all the eras, we also built private homes just like these public homes. I don't think San Diego really takes sacred public and private separate. How do you blend public and private, because it all became modern, isolated pods, and there was never any truly urban sort of building. It was all of a suburban type of pattern, and that made it the same, in my opinion. But that's not the purpose of why we're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder what you would say about part of architecture, just the role of churches these days, because right after World War II, every single new community was included places for churches.
Yeah, it was set up.
Claremont had quite a lot. Nowadays, developers go out of the way not to include church properties.
Yeah.
And because they don't want to be involved with competing congregations, so they simply say community center, but no church. So,
Yeah.
as a priest and in La Jolla, what do you make of that trend in American city planning that churches are not so important as they used to be?
Yeah, just let me back up and say the best example of what you're talking about is London, where I was from, where if you go around, you can't help noticing there's a church literally every 250 yards. The reason for that is that in Victorian times, when they were building all these churches, the developers would put in a church, because having a church in a development raised the value of the houses. So that's why London is full of churches. They were never ever full. There was never a time the churches were full, and now because they never needed them in the first place. But the developers built them to put the value up. And I think what you're saying, Roger, is that in post-war periods, the urban planners did set aside land for churches, because, as I said in the lecture, they felt these new communities needed community space. So I actually don't think there's a shortage of church buildings anymore. I think the challenge is maintaining the buildings we have. There's, as I mentioned as I went along, there's a few of those buildings that really are threatened, and some that have gone already. So my dream wouldn't be building new churches, it would be vibrant communities worshipping in the spaces we already have. Because this is my bugbear. That, I come from London. When you guys go to England, you all ooh and ah over thatched cottages. I couldn't care if I never saw a thatched cottage again. But similarly, coming over here as an English person, I ooh and ah over your fantastic post-war modernist buildings, of which you have a fantastic collection. But San Diegans have the same, well, not this crowd, but San Diegans in general have the same attitude to modernist buildings that I have to thatched cottages. It's vernacular, you see it everywhere. But so I would hope that, one thing I want to do is to raise an awareness of the quality of the sacred buildings and other buildings that there are in San Diego, in the hope that they're saved, and a worshipping community would think, well, rather than build a new church why don't we use one of the ones? There's at least two of the buildings I showed are empty, so a church can move into them any time.
Yeah, but they're under threat now because we just passed a law, California, that says you can build high-density, low-income, middle-income apartment complexes on church land.
Yeah, and
So
you're
going to see an effort to not only build on the parking lots in churches, but churches removed to make way for
That's
high-density
exactly right, because I mentioned that the church it's not just a church building, it's a campus. So the two buildings I showed that are empty and under threat, the actual church building only occupies a small place, small part of the footprint, which is why they're so attractive to developers, because you can build a lot of houses on an old church campus.
Well, and while you're doing it, the church is going to get submerged behind all those buildings.
Yeah.
In which case it might make sense for the developer just to eliminate the
I
church.
think the church being submerged wouldn't be the worst option.
It just becomes a secular space.
Yeah, it gets them all knocked down.
But it's affordable, that's the theory.
Are you seeing the same pre-modern, post history that you have shown us today in our church architecture happening in England?
Well, no, we don't have. Well, England doesn't have anything like this collection of churches. If you love it, Victorian church is great, it's full of them. But I think that was the point I'm trying to make. That San Diegans don't appreciate that they've got these incredible number of churches, because it's a new city that it burst after the war. So all these modernist churches were built in the new neighbourhood. You know, London doesn't change like that. We have one or two interesting modernist buildings, but not many. We didn't need them. We got the Victorians left us far too many.
So politicians, we need God. Sorry.
I think you made your best point when you said that churches become parking lots.
Yeah.
And parking lots become apartments.
Yeah.
San Diego, at least. Or condos.
Yeah, Mark, I'd just like to thank you for doing what you're doing. I mean, you've made an enormous contribution to the history of sacred architecture here, and more importantly, to the understanding of what those buildings were and are. So no one has done anything like this before. Thank you.
Well, thank you.